Hello, I'm Bob Norton, CEO of Airtight Management, which is all about scaling companies, and the CEO and Entrepreneurship Bootcamp, which is about startups and early launch of companies. This segment is about the 10 main challenges of scaling and growth. These are generic for almost every company, and the systems needed once you break $5 million will take you all the way to $100 million if they're done right. We're going to discuss the risks, the stages of growth, and the problems with growth. Now, a company should never scale until its value proposition has been proven to the customer and it has pretty firm marketing processes, sales processes, and operations processes, or the delivery of your product and service. If you don't have these processes well defined and documented, you're certainly not ready to scale yet. And I don't think that just knowing these challenges and traps will ever allow you to solve them all. What we're going to do is try to let you know what you don't know that is hiding under the surface, and if you haven't scaled a company to this size before, you will want a mentor or a coach and some advisors that have been there and done that to get to this kind of size of company before. So let's get started. Let's talk about breaking through some invisible barriers that most people who haven't grown a company before don't even know exist. The problem is that these problems or issues can really kill you, and you don't know it. So I like to compare it to breaking through the sound barrier, which killed a bunch of test pilots before they figured out how to build a plane to handle the disruption that was happening there. If you're growing a company for the first time, I can guarantee you there are hundreds of these unknown barriers that can get in your way. And finding these by trial and error can be fatal or limit your growth at a minimum, and it's far more expensive. Typically, a company should be able to grow at 50 to 100% per year if it's established and has a working set of processes for sales, marketing, and operations. More than that is quite a bit more difficult and generally requires you to have multiple management team members that have been in a rapid growth situation before, which would require more capital or more profit or revenue stream to support that typically. So being aware of those is the major goal of this particular course, to let you be aware of those things that could bite you without you even knowing they exist. So let's talk for a minute about the odds of reaching certain size in revenue of companies. This information is from the Kauffman Foundation, which is a great source of statistics on entrepreneurship. And what it shows is that only 4%, or 1 in 25 companies, will reach the lowly level of only $1 million in revenues. Getting to 10 million revenues is only going to happen on average to about 1 in 250 companies. And if you go up to $50 million in revenues, you're talking only about 1 in 1,700 companies that will achieve that level. So this is a high mountain to climb and takes a lot of preparation, risk, hard work, entrepreneurship, and usually a very solid team. Although a single founder can build and run $1 million company, it's very unlikely that one founder without a strong team is going to be able to build a company to $10 million or $50 million in revenues. That's why startups have to use their equity and try to bring in very experienced people to help and complement the skills so that they have an experienced management team that bring many skill sets to the table that will be needed for growth. Now let's look at a model of how a company grows. A model is very useful in understanding when you need to adjust your management style, planning horizon, risk level, and various other things that must change as a company grows. We at Airtight Management use a 5-level model of growth, and the idea is that a level 1 company is a raw startup, very agile and easy and quick to change, not a lot of customers or legacy issues, probably just a little bit of revenue to start, and still learning and validating their various internal processes, because the goal of a startup is really to validate the business model and the customer need and the market. A company that moves to stage 2, I would compare in this metaphor to a cabin cruiser. It's better run with multiple crew. It can't change speed and direction as quickly. But it's prepared to go for a longer voyage. As a company reaches about 1 to 3 million, very much dependent on the type of company, it needs to shift gears from that very raw startup, high-risk, agile mode to a longer planning horizon and more process and procedure and management. As a company gets bigger than that, moving to stage 3, it now has significant legacy issues with customers and things that it can't change and move as quickly. It needs to lower the risk because the bets it's taking on its brand and its revenue and other things are getting bigger and bigger. The downside is getting bigger. Planning horizons for everything need to expand or stretch out, and you need a much more disciplined approach to goal setting for quarters and years, and even a 5-year strategic plan at this point with a stage 3 company. Like a fleet, a company can usually only go as fast as the slowest ship in the fleet. And in the case of a business, that's the department or sometimes the senior managers and how good and effective they are. And complexity, as you go through this 5 stages of development, gets exponentially greater. A stage 4 company, which we're not going to talk about a lot here because it's a much larger company, is compared to an oil tanker here, because it requires miles of planning in advance to change and slow the engine and change direction. And then a very mature company, a larger company that's a conglomerate with many products and services potentially, is more like an aircraft carrier with a fleet of support ships. Lots of complexity needed in the management and planning and supplying of that ship. And you really can't take big chances with that because it's such an expensive proposition. So a startup must be, and when I say must, I mean it's because it's the advantage it has over every company, large or small, already in the marketplace. It must be lean and fast. It must be willing to adjust and change quickly, often called pivoting, as you learn more from the market, putting newer products and services into the marketplace. Almost never is it exactly as you had planned, the old battle phrase that, the plan is a must-have process, but as soon as the battle begins, the plan is out the window, and you've got to make rapid adjustments. A startup should have almost zero bureaucracy. It should be a very flat organization. Sometimes I like to call it a benevolent dictatorship, because the founder or the CEO really has to have their hands in all the pies and know what's going on to be able to make lean and fast and quick decisions. You've got to do things cheaply. A startup can typically do things at 10 or 20% of the cost of what a larger company might be, with less people and quicker, for many of the reasons that we're going to talk about here. You hire people just in time, and you're typically looking for 80% solutions. The 80-20 rule always is called the Pareto principle, almost always applies. And you don't want to spend 3 or 4 or even 10 times as much developing a product to serve the entire market as a larger company with hundreds or thousands of customers might have to. You really want to do it only to serve that 80% or best customer that you're targeting, which should be a niche as you enter the market, ideally a niche that bigger companies aren't interested in because it's too small, so that you can get established before you have head-to-head competition. Startups must be willing to take big risks, and they have the advantage of not having legacy issues. They don't have IT systems and customers that they have to support and lots of long-term contracts in place that would prevent them from doing certain things. So they really can pivot on a dime. As a startup, you really must take advantage of all of these things to be competitive and to get established. So here's a summary chart, and it's worth studying and printing off even and thinking about. You should certainly figure out where your company is today on these 5 stages of development. This particular course is for anyone in stages 1 through 3. You probably wouldn't need this course if you were already a rapid growth company and expanding, unless you're running into barriers and having problems. All of the same principles and best practices in management are going to apply. But I would recommend you print this off, study it, and think about, because you don't wake up one day and you've moved from stage 1 to stage 2. It's a gradual process. We have in-depth checklists of the things that need to be done, but typically the pain and suffering that's happening in the company and the complaints from customers or employees are going to point you in the direction of what needs to be done. Of course, being ahead of those and the experience to know and prepare from the advance is far superior than waiting for those negative signals. Now, I'm going to not read this for you, as I say. I'm just going to pause the video and let it play for a minute so that you can study it and screenshot it. Models are very critical to communicate and prepare things in advance and avoid surprises. And this is a really key model to understand. So here's another very important concept. It's what is called a success trap. It's important to understand that if you don't shift gears, your company will go sideways or potentially up and down or blow itself up if you're hitting these success traps. The most common ones are the first one when you hit $1 to $5 million in revenue. In most companies, as we discussed earlier, only 1 in 250 companies will really get to that, $5 million, $10 million level. So a lot of companies will go steady, and that's fine. It's a very profitable company, potentially for a small number of owners. Can be a lifestyle company that can make a very nice living, but it's probably not ever going to grow into a 10 or 25 or $50 million company unless management style and gears are shifted and a real management team is built. Plateau 1 holds most companies down. As we said, only about 1 in 25 companies will exceed $1 million. And so to get just over that and be in the top 4%, you need to learn how to shift gears. And you need to be aware of the problems that will happen with growth. Typically, the second trap is at the $3 to $15 million level. The reason those revenue ranges are so large is because a distributor might have 5 or 10 times the revenue of a company that sells directly. And so it very much depends on your business model and your industry and some other factors. But plateau number 2 is typically installing a lot of infrastructure and systems and continuing to build the team. So to get through plateau level 1, you typically need a good goal-setting system and good communications and some metrics on the business and maybe some process documentation. But all of those things have to get much more professional and better and go into much more depth to break through plateau level 2, because you need to to learn to run the business by the numbers then, using key performance indicators or KPIs and dashboards, having strategic planning meetings so that your planning horizon and goal setting is appropriate for the quarter and the year. Those kinds of things that are thought of as more professional management and management best practices. As a matter of fact, research shows that Peter Drucker, who invented management by objective and is often called the father of management, research shows that doing goal setting right, his MBO system in particular, increases value creation in a business by 56%. Now think of that compounded annually. That really sets the difference between the also-ran companies and the market leaders just doing that well. So it's rare, if ever, that a company will break through plateau level 1 and get to plateau level 2 without a good goal-setting system that solves all kinds of problems. And we have a course on MBO. It's really not very different from OKR, which has come into vogue. It's sort of just another name, objectives and key results, because it's been used by Google and Intel and some other famous companies, and venture capitalists talk it up. But the reality is it's just a rebranding of Peter Drucker's management by objective with all the same principles that are required because of the psychology of people. So let's get into the top 10 problems of growth more specifically. What we've given you so far is sort of foundational information or context for how a company grows. Problem number 1 is the rapid dilution of management time. There's a concept called span of control, which says that typically for every 7 individual contributors, there needs to be a manager to supervise and make sure they're rowing together and doing all the right things and staying productive, and of course aligned with the goals of the organization. This can be less or more with virtual companies and remote workers and various technologies that can be used to manage people. But you must be aware that as a company grows, you do have to add managers if you don't want the management expertise and intellect and work ethic and everything else to be diluted. You also need to begin to formalize processes so there can be goal setting, as we talked about earlier, most importantly as a foundational blocking and tackling tool of management, and also KPIs, or key performance indicators, which are metrics for the inputs and outputs of processes or departments or even individuals. So it's important to think about maintaining that ratio, whatever it is that works for you, but 7-to-1 is very common, of managers versus regular individual contributors or employees. Problem of growth number 2, which we've already alluded to a little bit, I'm terming clouding of accountability and lines of authority. This is where productivity dives as a company gets bigger and requires some bureaucracy, although not a lot. In fact, it's only about 5% overhead for all of the management systems that I recommend in running a company. But it does require documentation. Every job should have a job description, and the lines of authority of that person ought to be made clear. That means it has to be communicated well, it has to be documented. Every process in an organization should have a diagram, ideally, with some footnotes, and more importantly, an owner of that process from start to finish. If there are multiple owners, maybe it should be 2 processes or 3 processes, because in a growing organization, you want to capture the metrics or the inputs of every process and the outputs of every process to track. As Peter Drucker said, you can't improve what you don't measure, and that's literally true, because if you're not measuring it, how would you know whether it was declining or improving or staying the same? So it's very important to have, a health check at each level in an organization, at a job level, at a department level, at the whole organization level. And that's why typically a company that gets to stage 3 and is in rapid growth will probably have 3 levels of dashboards. One at the total corporate level, one for the department and its inputs and outputs, and then one for inside the department that has a lot more detail, which is typically used to look at the KPIs for individuals. When you have those job descriptions and you have those metrics for what someone should be producing, you can then manage the business by the numbers. Common problem of growth number 3 is insufficient investment in documentation of processes and training of these processes and jobs. A company that needs to scale does not just need to know how to do the job. It needs to know how to hire someone to do that job, how to train someone to do that job, and also how to manage someone to do that job. And some of the things we've already talked about, accountability, MBOs, and KPIs, are the tools to make sure that happens. But for a company to scale, you must have some standardization of processes. And I'm not talking about every little thing the organization does. Typically, you might have 10 or 20 processes in an organization that add value and create value for either internal people or the customer directly. They can be in marketing, sales, finance, operations, product development, really any area of the business. But because as you scale, you're going to have turnover, you really need a firm process for how you'll replace people, hire them, what's the criteria required, and an onboarding process to train them so that it's not disruptive of the business. The reality is that as you grow faster and faster, the growth sort of gets exponential. It's not linear, because 100% growth in $1 million company is $1 million, but 100% growth in a $10 million company is $10 million. So you're going to have more turnover. You're going to have to make an investment in training. And this cannot be left to a single person. You need to institutionalize and document all this information so that if key people leave or the proverbial get hit by a bus happens to them, a number of life circumstances that might have nothing to do with them, that requires them to leave the business, your business is not hampered or even handcuffed to not be able to move forward, and it can destroy the business's monthly, quarterly, or even annual plan, depending on how senior the person is. You cannot allow people to silo information and be the only ones that have it if you're going to have an organization that is going to scale. As Ronald Reagan said, trust but verify. And that means measuring and documenting everything. Now, in addition, to really achieve this, you've got to move away from micromanagement and use management by objective. And the higher form of management, we teach 5 styles of management that every manager should know, is management by exception. When you have the process documented and good KPIs or metrics for inputs and outputs, you can then manage that by exception only when things go wrong or deviate from the norm. Common problem of growth number 4 is a lack of the discipline needed to manage by the numbers. Now, you may think I've talked about this before because I've mentioned KPIs, but I'm actually bringing it up a level, and I'm talking about the discipline of putting all the KPIs together into a dashboard, which is a time series, so that you can notice trends. The best dashboard is actually all numbers, not graphs and pretty colors, but what's called a high ink to paper ratio, so that the amount of information shrunk down onto a page is large, and you can see the relationships between certain numbers changing and potentially impacting others. So when a department reaches more than 5 to 7 people, or a company is reaching 7 to 10 people overall, it needs a corporate dashboard for the company as well as an internal dashboard to manage and measure both the people and the inputs and the outputs of the department. And that should be compared and tracked. It becomes a shorthand for all the senior managers and the department heads, and it should be something they own and control and are proud to report to the team and to use to set goals. An objective or management by objective goal, or OKR, for the month might be to improve a particular KPI by 10%. So you can see how KPIs and dashboards and MBO all support each other and help communicate up and down the organization as well as across the organization. Few people know how to design a dashboard. I've really never gone into a company as a consultant and seen a company that has a good dashboard, even though they think they do. This is a pretty complicated process, and there's a lot of art in it because you need both the business knowledge and you need to map it into the strategic plan and the overall objectives of the company. So get an expert to design your dashboard. It's one of the biggest bang for your buck investments you'll ever make, because figuring it out over 1 or 2 or 3 years can cost a small fortune in trial and error. So you never, ever want to do that. Bring in an expert, and don't leave it up to the software people or the accounting people to design dashboards, because there's actually 4 categories of numbers, and it's not all about dollars, which the accountants know. It's about productivity. It's about all of the processes in the organization and what's going to make that organization work. Once you have these tools that I've talked to about so far in place, you're now prepared to scale the business without potentially the wheels falling off the car as you go faster and faster on the highway. You have an unambiguous way to communicate with agreed upon KPIs for every process and every department. Common problem of growth number 5 is not stretching out your planning time horizons and doing the long-term strategic planning that's needed. As a startup, you're making rapid decisions every day with a very small number of people, and it's easy to communicate informally at the water cooler or formally by email or quick talk in the hallway. As a company moves to stage 2 and has significant revenues and customers, and people begin to specialize more and things start to separate into departments, communication gets slower and harder. It's important to have weekly, monthly, and quarterly meetings between department heads or key people to make sure they stay synchronized and aren't running in different directions or fighting, and making sure they're coordinating. This is just normal human behavior. And in entrepreneurship, you're shooting from the hip. But once you're to stage 2 and 3 of growth in a company, these problems that would have been easy to fix by one person now can be 100 or literally even 1,000 times larger because they impacted 100 customers or 1,000 customers. So the cost for miscommunications and lack of planning grows exponentially as the company does too. So I recommend an annual 2-day off-site strategic planning process, a quarterly 1 day, and it might be a half a day if there weren't any changes, with all of the management attending. This is collaborative management where everyone is part of the process and buys into it and has the opportunity to both have input and learn from the process. And then, of course, the monthly meetings and weekly meetings, weekly staff meetings that can be quick and just deal with what are the roadblocks that we're getting through this week, what are the things that are holding us back, so they can pick the team's management expertise and the brain of the entire team. And the quarterly and monthly meetings are more about what are the MBOs, what are the metric goals, the KPI goals for the business, and making sure that everyone is coordinating everything across departments. Common problems of growth number 6 is dealing with legacy issues with customers and even technology or IT, various things in your company that essentially have inertia and yet need to be moved along and may slow and impact other departments and create risk. Often a company that is scaling needs to separate research and development or any kind of product or service development from the operations. Otherwise, the people responsible for creating new and innovative products are sort of slowed down by the current product, and they wind up taking on support roles, and their productivity plummets. This is very important in software, but the principles apply in almost every kind of business where you're trying to push the state of the art and innovate and do new things. This is called skunkworks, technically, and it was invented by Lockheed Martin. We have an entire course in our CEO boot camp that explains how to get 11 to 17 times more productivity out of a high-performance team, and that means very senior people who are isolated in a skunkworks to do the next-generation product. This also allows you to attract the top players for that most interesting cutting-edge work and use the maintenance and less innovative work for bringing in medium-level people and as a training ground for them, because a high-performance team is by definition only all senior people together, and one novice or trainee can really slow that down. At Thomson, we had about, my previous company, which is Thomson Reuters, we had about 11 times the industry standard productivity, and that's because we had this separation and all the best people in a high-performance team. The result was we didn't have the scale of the business and the customer needs dragging on pushing innovation and coming out with the next product. Therefore, we actually had a 100% success rate in launching a new product each year. And of course, it doesn't mean you're not dedicating time to launch and support the new product and train operations, but you're not having that high performance team mirrored completely in that work. Common problems of growth number 7 is that problems can get hidden by larger numbers. Again, a tool to solve this is good metrics and process management in your organization, because you need to watch ratios. You should be looking at how many widgets per hour or how many widgets per month, not an absolute number of widgets, because as that number of widgets gets larger and larger, it becomes kind of meaningless unless you're comparing it to a timeline of the productivity historically. So as the family and team spirit in a company fades, individual productivity can suffer, sometimes dramatically. This is why benchmarks for performance must be set with KPIs, and good management will be looking at these constantly to make sure productivity isn't going down. Don't just look at the widgets produced, look at the widgets per person. Or the widgets per hour, or the widgets per process. One great thing about ratios and many KPIs is they can be compared across any time frame. So that ratio can show differences from week to week or day to day or month to month and still be the same metric. That's one of the beauties of good KPIs is they create a language that creates consistency across the organization, but also over time, because a ratio shouldn't change unless you're working on making it better or there's an outside force making it worse. And when you see that trend, you at least know where to invest management time so that those large numbers don't cover up problems that need management time and attention. Common problems of growth number 8 is political, or what some call cover your ass stuff, increasing bureaucracy without any advantage to the customer or the market that winds up being a drag on the organization's costs and productivity. As a company gets bigger, a certain amount of politics is inevitable. But typically somewhere between 50 and 100 people, an organization can run off the rails in getting very political. This is best fought by communicating clearly from the top down that the company is a meritocracy, that you don't get promoted because you compliment the CEO or play squash with them after work and those sorts of things, but that organizations promote based on merit. That keeps the best people there because they know they're going to be rewarded, and it doesn't keep the worst people there. They're more likely to leave because they know they're not going to climb up the organization because they're not performing as well. I call the ideal culture in a rapid growth company a Darwinian meritocracy. And by Darwinian, I mean there's what's called a selection pressure on good people staying and bad people leaving. It means the organization will evolve and adapt to circumstances, both inside and outside the organization, and the economic environment and the industry, and every other pressure on the organization. While the meritocracy part means people that perform well are promoted. Nepotism and politics are squashed at every opportunity. And if that message is sent by senior managers, and especially the CEO and founders, putting aside their ego and thinking about their fiduciary responsibilities and not personal issues, but about the company's issues, then others in the organization will get that, and you'll have a much more effective organization. Important corporate decisions should never be made for personal reasons. And I'm always amazed at the number of people that don't get that and don't understand what their fiduciary responsibility to the company is. Of course, the higher up in the organization, the higher your level of fiduciary responsibility. As a director or an officer, you have a very high standard of making decisions in the best interest of the company, not the best interest of yourself. Of course, as you go down to individual contributors, not only do they lack the understanding of this issue, but they don't have the legal responsibility to the corporation and the shareholders to do what's right for the company. So we'll have more on Darwinian meritocracy as a model for the ideal culture, but let's move on to the next. Common problems of growth number 9. Stretching out and adjusting your risk profile based on where the company is in its development cycle is very important. There's a concept called frugal experimentation. Jim Collins, in his books, talks about this as shooting bullets until you hit the target and then shooting a cannonball. So you try things at low cost and lots of them, and then you invest in the ones that really work. So a startup, might spend $1,000 or $5,000 or $10,000 on trying out and proving an idea, where a bigger company might have to spend $1 million with a staff of several people over many months to figure out a new product opportunity idea. Their cost of investigating it and looking at it and planning for it could exceed the total cost that a startup would take in actually building the product. That's not to say that you shouldn't be doing good market research and planning and of course, validating that product with customers along the way. But only by changing these risk profiles and horizons as the company gets bigger can we both take advantage of the advantages of startups and be nimble and innovative. And this is a graph in Jim Collins' book, Good to Great 2, that shows the quadrants of the people that have both high discipline and high innovation. So that's really what we're talking about here. Take risks that are appropriate and proportionate to your size of the business, and you'll find that your innovation will help you create market leaderships. Startups can change a product every month, but an established company obviously can't do that without upsetting customers and having excessive cost issues. Common problems of growth number 10. Linear percentage growth is really exponential growth as a company begins to scale. Because as we mentioned before, 50% growth on a $1 million company is not a huge number, but 50% growth on a 10 or 20 or $50 million company or revenue base is a huge number, and it requires lots more thought and planning, and you must take lower risk or take a lower risk path because the cost of failure gets extremely high when you're talking about these kinds of numbers and scale and planning horizons. That's why as companies get bigger, their decisions have to be more conservative. And as we said earlier, if you can separate innovation to take lots of small risks into a skunk works, you'll be a long way into preventing yourself from being hit with these kinds of costly errors. So a company, as it requires and grows, starting with a goal and working back, should be planning, 1 to 3 months ahead for operations in a startup. But in a stage 2 or even a stage 3 company, you ought to be planning a quarter to a year in advance. And many people don't have forethought, and typically a manager must have forethought. They must be able to sit down and make a plan for the year. They must be able to sit down and make a budget for the year. And if you're growing your own managers, you need to train them to do that and force them to do that, because no good manager or no manager is going to be successful if they don't develop these planning skills and start thinking way ahead of the day or the week or the month. So each of these 10 problems seems pretty manageable, but it's easy to say and hard to do. There is experience and art involved in the solutions to each of these problems. All of it comes back to using proven best practices like Kaizen, which means constant and never-ending improvement in the organization. That's enabled by dashboards and metrics to be a feedback loop. You've got to use proven best practices to hire and train people and manage people. All of these things have 100 years of management science behind them, but I find most of our universities don't teach these things, and in some cases they can't because they only are developed with practice in the real world. They're not sort of academic ideas that you can study. But if you want to grow smoothly, you've got to watch and optimize processes. You've got to document them. You should be constantly studying best practices. And I don't mean that on one level, like in your industry or in a specific technical skill. I mean best practices in management science and leadership and process management and other things. And of course, already said strategic planning and having the discipline to do that, so the urgent doesn't get in the way of the important that must be done. Too many people have the excuse of, I don't have any time to do the strategic planning, but then they have plenty of time to redo it or plenty of time to fail, which is more likely when you don't think through and plan things and have a vision. Companies are built by hiring and retaining the best people and by giving them good learning opportunities and growth in their career so that they'll not only get cash compensation, but they'll be appreciated and their career will grow. Like I said, all these things are easy to say, but somewhat hard to do. Here's a quick little bio for me, just for reference, and I'll skip right through that. All of these are generally embedded in what we call the airtight management first three systems, which are a strategic planning process, and our kit is available on Amazon.com for all of those processes and tools. There's something near 100 different tools in that kit, and of course you won't use them all, but I would recommend hiring a facilitator for a strategic planning process, and we do that, and we'll also take full responsibility for the development of a strategic plan. Our system 2 is what we call management best practices, and that's a bucket or a barrel full of the proven ideas and principles that I've extracted over 30 years as a CEO from a top 1,000 books that I've read along the way in all those years, and tried to curate and put into systems, which comes out of my engineering background, because I used to be a VP of engineering and a chief technical officer, and am usually a scientist at heart and a businessman by need. And then the third system, which of course we've talked a lot about, is dashboards and metrics. And as I said, very few people have the experience across many businesses and many industries to figure out what the best KPIs for your business should be. So I do strongly recommend, and as I said, I think it's one of the best bangs for the buck you'll ever get. We can generally design and train and coach a team through the creation of a corporate dashboard for just a few $1,000s. And most companies will never, ever figure that out right without that kind of experience on their team. So thanks for joining us for this top 10 issues with growth. And we look forward to providing other courses. We have the CEO and Entrepreneurship Bootcamp, which is going online in September of 2020, which is about 20 hours of the best content, if I do say so myself, to prepare entrepreneurs and startup CEOs. And any CEO, even ones with 5 years experience, will come away with an enormous number of tools and new knowledge that they can use to improve their business. Thanks for attending. I'm Bob Norton of Airtight Management and the CEO Bootcamp, and I hope to see you at one of our live courses.